What's going on, guys? We have another basics video where we're talking about card value, or Riptide Math. Now, Riptide Math is a little bit of a dry subject because it is basically math, but it is incredibly important to understand how you draw value from Riptide and how you generate that, because it's a little bit different than most heroes. You generate value based on offensive and defensive, on hits, trap, triggers, and so on and so forth. Things to consider whenever you're trying to understand the valuations is it depends on things like life total, on hits, tempo, if the traps can trigger, and certain situations like matchups. An example being is that whenever you are on offensive and defensively, Falcon Wing has pretty much the same value. Now, in the case that you have a life lead of say 10, then you would prioritize this being a offensive card more because you can get your opponent's life total much further down and to a point where things like trap pings are potentially lethal. That can also change in the event that you have something like Rain Razors and you can utilize it, which then pushes this card to having a much higher offensive value because of a different reason. If your opponent just sends raw damage at you and you have that life lead, it ends up just being better to send it offensively. Some of the basic values that you have on each individual cards are things like blocking with a non-trap card has a usual block value of 2 to 3. 0 for 4s that are not traps, where they have a base level block of 4 plus a value from their associated effects. So Fade for Seeing, Sink Below, Take Cover, Shelter, things like that. Take Cover being the prime example of when it's an arsenal, it allows you to put a Cru Trap from hand if you do not draw another trap, so that you can actually still utilize it. Or, in the case of Dominate, this card allows you to massively navigate around Dominate-like effects with its reload. Arcane Barrier, pretty straightforward. It converts each resource into one value. These are the basic values to understand just to have a general idea of where your stuff converts. Death Dealer is a little bit more complex. This card effectively equals a card for a card to put an arrow into arsenal. So it usually has a value of 0 because you're just trading card for card. Whether or not you evaluate each individual card better or worse is dependent on the situation. Pitching a yellow or blue, though, effectively discounts any 1 or 2 cost arrow, creating 1 to 2 free value, because in that case, you are now generating free resources in addition to still getting that card back into hand. Tunic, on the other hand, does convert a resource from Tunic to a strict 3 value card because you are generating a full card value off of the situation. Now, there is an implied value on this card from digging for relevant traps for certain matchups or certain cards for certain matchups, like Tar Pit and Collapsing. So digging through your deck can actually have a little bit of an extra value associated with it. Dreadbore and Castaway are a little bit more odd because they don't generate you card value, they generate you just effects. So if you pitch a red or you're not utilizing the blue when you pitch a blue, you have a -2 value because while you are generating +1 off the effect on Dreadbore, you are not utilizing the extra resources or you're not generating an extra card. So that card value of 3 ends up being -2 as a result. Usually you only do that if you have extra cards in hand, but it does have a 1 converted value whenever you utilize its effect. Now there's a huge, massively implied value on evasion for defense reactions, but that's a little hard to quantify because it does not factor in if they don't have one, just if they do. Barbed Castaway has the same evaluation of if you use the first effect, but it's a little bit different because usually when you're using it, it's an instant, so therefore you're using it on a turn 0, for example, when your opponent just passes priority or something of the sort. But the aim's converted value really depends on the arrow. So this card has a hard evaluation because of how it operates. You have to base it upon the actual arrow itself, which we'll get into. Alright, moving on to traps, specifically Go-Again traps. So all these have a base value of 3 plus a damage ping from Riptide. We're assuming that all of these trigger just to get a general idea of the value. Frailty trap is a little more complex because it depends on who you're playing against. But typically speaking, if they have an arsenal, you get 4 value off of it plus the 1 from Frailty, because if they attack from arsenal, it gets -1. So you get around 5 value. But Frailty can extend to more value. A big example being with Brute, and they use a Blood Rush Bellet with Claws. If they send Claw, Arsenal, you get 3 value off of Frailty. So just understanding the maximum and the floor, based upon the matchup, Warriors for example being one, you can generate an idea of how much value you get from the card. Tar Pit is a little bit more unknown, because it depends on the matchup and it depends on the on hit. Sometimes, for example, you play this and it just equals 4 because you just get hit with the CNC and you don't even really have an arsenal, so you don't care. It's irrelevant on hit at that point. But sometimes that CNC can matter, and you do have an arsenal that you need, but Tar Pit turns it off completely. Usually against Assassin, this card is key because it generates so much value based upon, let's say they send a hand disruption card, that turning it off massively changes the state of the game. Chain Reaction, its value is based upon the individual non-attack action you play and how you generate advantage from it. We're not really going to go too deep into that, but because it is a 0 for 3 that does get the ping, it is still worth noting that it has a value of 4, similar to Tar Pit. Collapsing Trap is a little bit more odd because it has a maximum, but also has a potential to make things harder for you. So the value from this card is generated from deck damage and also disrupting their turn cycle and making them have to reevaluate based upon what they first played. So we'll say that they played a head jab from hand and they still have 3 cards in hand, so they didn't pitch or anything. And you play this. So they discard 3 cards, which is the value of 3 cards each. You have the 4 value from the 3 block and the damage ping. So 4 plus 3 cards that they discarded. So that is 16. And now their new hand is -1. So if you want to be technical, you could say that the -1 does add value, but it is perceived value as far as allowing you to not block that turn, which is a little bit different. But it can break their hand. It can make them go into a situation where they now just have, instead of 4 head jabs that they had in hand, which were really good for their turn, now they have the head jab that they played and a blue and then a 1 for 4, which is okay. To go on to buff traps, they have the same general value with the 1 damage ping, but with things like Inertia Trap, you have implied value based upon the general value of a card. So if they end up ending the turn on an arsenal, let's say they send a E-Strike for 7, and they plan on arsenaling a card, and then you play this onto the E-Strike, you now have a value of 7, because you force them to not get that card into arsenal. When you combine this with stuff like Dreadbore, where they try to get those D-Reacts into arsenal, this value is actually theoretically higher, because now you can generate value upon forcing them to block with real cards instead of that D-React, and it gets still stuck in the deck. Boulder Trap gives you a value based on a future potential value by essentially getting rid of life total, because you can put a counter on a 2 equipment that then makes it to where they can't do that full 2 block, giving them effectively 2 less life. Or you can use it on stuff like Ram's Head to diminish the overall future value that the Guardian has on the entire rest of the game. A big one being is Stalagmite, where by doing that, you actually forcibly make them not be able to generate that extra frostbite because they can't block a second time anymore. So just understanding where you can get the value on where you put the counter, and also putting the counter on something that is irrelevant that you want them to block with, or that you don't want them to block with, and then forcing them to have to block when they need block value with something that you don't want on the field. So Flick Knives, for example. Giving it to their Tunic instead of their Flick Knives is huge, because now if they need to block, they have to block with the Flick Knives. So this is the value that you usually get for Boulder Trap, but there's a little bit of an asterisk there. Buzzsaw Trap is theoretically infinite. There is no determined value on this card because it is really dependent on the situation. But it is always 4 plus whatever value that you generate that you reduce the attack on. It could be 2, it could be 10. They could have double Caspa and then gotten 12 mites plus the one that they did from the discard because they had a massive turn or something like that. And therefore, you just got 13 value off of this. It can be insane. But overall, this card is essentially infinite, and there's no real way to define it until you actually get to the situation. Blood Rot Trap is just exactly 6. It is exactly 6 value. Pendulum Trap is dependent on the actual value that you give towards deck damage. And in some cases you don't, but in some cases you do, because say, for example, you hit a CNC or a Codex of Frailty. That's insane. Those are great cards. That value is wild. However, maybe you're just an aggro deck and you're like, I don't care because they're going to have to block with that card anyways. So then you just don't really put too much value onto it. Depends on the situation, but overall deck damage is relevant to mention because it does equal 6. Spike Pit kind of has a similar situation. However, Spike Pit does do a lot of damage. It is based upon how many cards of the same name are in your graveyard. So, if they mill a card and they have all 9 of the Fool Collar, so they have 9 copies of it, they lose 9 life plus the 1 ping, plus the deck damage. So that's how we evaluate that is 4 plus 9, 13, plus 1 card value, 19 total. But it could be very low as well, because if it only hits a single copy of a card that they did not have another one in the grave, it could equal just the baseline 5, because it does count itself. Cru Traps always trigger. They always have the ping, so therefore stuff like Tripwire is always 5 value. Its on hit can matter, but it depends on the situation. Because you're usually blocking 4, a lot of the on hits aren't going to matter too much. But if you can catch them on a situation where they don't have a floating resource or tunic, then this card can generate huge amounts of advantage. I've had very few situations where they don't just have at least 1 floating anyways. This card might just be cursed for me. Pitfall Trap kind of falls in the same category, where if you have the resource, then it doesn't really matter that much. You just get the 4 value based on the block and the ping. But if you actually do manage to catch them off guard, you can generate 6 total value, which is 3 on offense and 3 on defense. And this card allows you to actually win through turn cycles and walk down life totals effectively. Rockslide Trap has the same problem as Tripwire Trap, where sometimes it just does not matter, and they always like have the extra resource. But it's a little bit worse because its base ceiling is, or its base floor is 3, and its ceiling is 5. And even then, 5 is not a great value for a card. So Rockslide Trap currently does not fit where you would need, but its value is still relevant in some cases. Arrows. So 0 cost arrows are pretty much just implying that they are in Arsenal and not adding any effects from bows onto it. Is most of them 0 for 4s. They have a value of 4 base and then whatever associated value based on their on hit. So Drill Shot, for example, being a -1 counter on an equipment they control. That can equal 1 to 2 armor value. Searing Shot, very basic, 5, because they lose 1 life. That is loss of life though, which is really nice because things like Calming Breeze do not affect that. Bolt and Shot. It has a value of 4, however, if it does gain power, we'll assume through a buff, it does have a base value of the card itself, 5, because Go Again does have a evaluation of 1. Endless Arrow is a effective draw. It kind of acts like a ponder token. So by attacking with it and it hitting, you generate a card's worth of value that you can utilize for Arsenal, assuming that you do not have another card in hand, similar to Ponder. So you have about a total value of 7 if it hits. There's a relevant thing to mention on deck health, having extra cards in deck. Endless Arrow does indeed provide that, but it's more direct in the hand as opposed to Salvage Shot, which goes just to the actual deck later. Murkmire is similar to Buzzsaw Trap in the sense that its value is theoretically infinite. Your opponent, say Enigma, could have every single aura out in the world that they could even feasibly run, and this will still have a value of 4 plus all of those if it hits. Murkmire is dependent on the situation and how much you can guarantee that you push the damage, and in some cases it is an automatic block, so that's where the value from Murkmire usually comes from. Stone Rain is a very heavy implied value. Sometimes the actual on hit does not really matter because it's just a card that they're going to Arsenal anyways, since they get to choose. But when you pair it with other things like Seek and Destroy, it does have a huge amount of value because you can forcibly get rid of the card. Dominate, though, does add a baseline value to the card because Dominate is harder to block. When paired with other non-attack actions that buff, Dominate can actually guarantee, or at least kind of guarantee, those on hits to generate your value. So it's a more implied value based upon the situation. Amplifying Arrow has a weird scale behind it because its value is not straightforward. It is based upon the number of total buffs. So if you are able to buff it 3 times, then you generate a slight advantage over most of the 0 for 4s. But it being yellow does generate a little bit more advantage over the reds in general. Moving on to 1 cost arrows, we have Fatigue Shot, which has a base value of 5 damage, plus whatever the base power of the card that they play has. 1 will always be rounded up to 1, so it's irrelevant, but If it's 2 to 11, you get 1 to 5 value based on the on-hit effect, which can make it go all the way up to 10 total value on this card. Headshot is always worth 6, assuming it gets put face up. Heatseeker is 5 plus the on-hit, which is essentially a free arsenal. However, there's a caveat there. Even though it can be theoretically worth 3 value, it can also be worth 0 value, because it being put face up, if it's a blue arrow, it could be strictly worse, or require you to have an off turn to play it. And because it is face up, you cannot trench it away. So there's a bit of an asterisk on the total value for this card. Hemorrhage Bore is 5, plus on hit it does destroy an arsenal if you have a name counter on it. So it can have a potential value of 8 because it destroys a card. However, because unlike CNC, it does not have the text that D-Reacts cannot be played on it from Arsenal alone. So therefore, many times if they have a D-React in Arsenal, this card is just reading 1 for 5, ideal 1 damage. 1-cost arrows going on. The infecting, sedation, and withering shot, or the associated diseases that they have a little bit of math to them. But across the board, they are about the same to their counterparts like the laces or the traps. Just leave that on the screen for a second. This is the general value associated to them. It's the same as before. We already talked about them. Moving on. Salvage shot, like I said before, is +1 deck health. Now, however you quantify that, if you actually put that as a full card value or not, it's kind of up to you. I usually put an asterisk on this whenever I play it because I'm not going to see it until late game, so it could basically not have an on hit. But in the matchups that it is relevant, it can have an on hit. So a little bit of an asterisk there. Remorseless is one of those cards that has a theoretically infinite value based upon the total number of cards they can play. So this card against things like Warrior typically doesn't have a massive amount of value because they don't play a huge amount of non-attack actions. And if they do, it's usually like maybe 1 with like hit and run or something like that. So typically against Warriors, you're having about a 6 total value associated with them. But there is something worth noting is the defense reaction evasion. If you compare it with other stuff, the evasion of effectively making it to where when paired with Dreadbore, no DX can be played on this card at all, massively spikes the value of this card. So moving on to 2-cost arrows. So Murky Water, you have to look at it line by line to understand the value that it brings. So whenever you're playing it just from Arsenal, so you're pitching 2, it is 6 damage, but on hit it has a value of 4 because you get a trap, and most of the traps end up being a value of 3 plus the 1 ping. Now, because of the RNG nature of that, sometimes the value is higher and sometimes it's pretty much the baseline 4. So as a result, it's really hard to like put a defined value on the trap with the exception of just saying what the minimum value is. So usually on hit, if you get all 6 damage, it is 6 plus 4. Now, when you add aim to it, it does increase the value that the card has with the dominate and the +1 extra damage. Roughly give that a value of 2 to 3 based upon what other buffs you're giving to it as well. Battering Bolt is much easier to quantify because it is just a raw 6, but on hit it does force a discard on non-action cards, which does equal a 3 per card and 1 loss of life per card, so 4 per card that's discarded. Now, even if you do not hit any cards because they discard them because of shelter or they blocked with them, you do get hand information. So even if it's a hero that doesn't have as many, you do get to see what their turn cycle is going to be, which lets you prepare or know what you can block and get away with, blocking a little bit, taking a little bit of damage, and then swing back with another big card. These arrows are difficult to quantify because their value is really dependent on the opponent, the matchup, and just so many other factors. Barbed Castaway being a big one because you can say red and they have an all blue hand, or you could say blue and they have an all red hand, and the on hit could just not matter. Hamstring shot, it's dependent on your opponent's hand, but against redline usually has a value of 3 for the on hit because they have to pitch one of their quote unquote head jabs to actually continue on their turn, which gives you an evaluation of 3. But against decks like Zen, who have a huge amount of blues, this card typically is just one tax, doesn't really do too much in the grand scheme of things. Sleep Dart, again, we'll use the Zen example. You could send Sleep Dart against Zen, and they could say, I don't have a chi in hand, so sure, take 5. And nothing happens. But you could send it to them, and then they say, I have a chi in hand. I can't activate my hero ability. My hand is infinitely worse now. So then Sleep Dart becomes a strictly better on hit. That has a value that is still hard to quantify, but much higher. Intoxicating Shot. On hit, the on hit actually has a negative value, which is a weird card. This card is still weird. It has a negative value of 1 or 2. However, near the late game, you can encourage your opponent to block this if they're at a low enough life total, because let's say they're at 3 or even 2, and they block for 3, taking 1, going to 1 or 2, but now all their attacks trigger a trap, no matter on if they want to or not. So intoxicating is you really have to understand situation and context before you try to send this card, or it can really screw you. It will take a single time of you getting hit with a CNC for 7 go again for you to just despise this card. Be careful. Immobilizing Shot. The example I like to utilize with this card is in the case that you are going in the mirror match and you go, here's Immobilizing Shot for X amount of damage, and they go, okay, block with 2 cards and then take a little bit of damage, and they go, here's a buff and 0 for 4 arrow. Your on hit did nothing. So going to buffs, laces are the same as your corresponding attack. It just adds 3 because it's a buff. Specifically with Lace with Inertia, we decided to put an asterisk Seek because they essentially have the same effect. The only major difference being that Seek actually destroys the card and puts him into the graveyard, while Lace puts him on the bottom of the deck. Both are good. Sometimes they have differing value based upon the matchup. Sometimes hitting a D-React and putting it under into the bottom of the deck is better than hitting a D-React and sending it to grave, just because of Dreadbore. Premeditate is 3 damage. It extends throughout the entire turn. On hit, a free arsenal. So the total potential evaluation of 6 total. Rain Razors is 2 damage times the number of arrow attacks you can send. Pretty much how you quantify that card. It is an instant speed, so it acts as sort of a reaction for Riptide, and also as a reload that you can do. So if you're able to play a card and get an on hit because of inefficient blocking from your opponent, so you can give it an evaluation that is a little bit different based upon your on hits that you can actually get. So whenever you're trying to figure out your turn cycle, keep note of that card. Point the Tip and Line It Up are very similar in value, but they do a different way, and each have their downsides associated with it. Line Up being a yellow, but also costs 1, but also blocks for 3, and it also turns something from face down to face up to give it an aim counter. So Line Up can pair really well with something like Murky Water to give it an aim counter and send it for 10 Dominate. Point the Tip can give advantage to a card you already have face up, or that you still use that one resource that you use for Line It Up to put it face up with, say, Dreadbore, and it still comes in for the same value, but you had to do it in a particular way. So just understand that these have a value that is 3 plus X, which is whatever the value that comes from the aim counter. Deadeye is a little more straightforward, but we assume that it has an aim counter on it just because of the value being harder to quantify. If aim, it has a discard, which is a value of 3, potentially more if you can screw up their entire turn cycle. Increased Attention is a harder card to evaluate because we already have access to Dreadbore. So, at the moment, doesn't seem relevant. But Release Attention, on the other hand, when you play Dreadbore, your opponent naturally tries to put a D-React into Arsenal. In some cases, they end up taking damage to put that card into Arsenal. So, by playing Release Attention, which is a 0 for 3, you can actually generate huge amounts of advantage because you force your opponent to take more damage, or in some cases, force them to turn off their turn and then get stuck with another D-React in hand and have an inefficient turn as a result. Fletch and Exhale is a little bit of an awkward card because it depends on if your opponent's blocking and what card they block with. By basic, you have, by the basic values, you have a 1 for 4, 3, 2, and at the very least, if they try to give you 2 cards to do a 2-card hand, -1 to 2 potentially. Melting Point. So Melting Point's a little awkward because it is one of those cards that's really only good into matchups that we actually are already good into. In the case of this card, though, it is still a 1 for 4 that has a block value of 3, and it can potentially gain value off of the aim counter effect to destroy a dagger or something that some ninjas, warriors, or assassins have. The non-attack actions. The codexes have a strange difference of value based upon their laces because of how they operate. So all of them have the baseline value of the ponder, and then they have their current disease that gives you a different value. But then they have like the last line of text. For Blood Rot, we have a potential card that they get stuck into Arsenal. Let's say that they have a card that they wanted to use for pitch to send Hammer as a Guardian. You now put that blue into Arsenal. Not only can they not block with it, not only can they not pitch with it for Blood Rot, but now they get a card that they're going to have to take a turn cycle of extra damage just to get it out of Arsenal, in some cases. Codex is a very implied value. The Codex of Frailty value comes from the fact that you convert this card into extra value and then additional value by getting an attack back. Some matchups where stuff like Battering Bolt is insane. Being able to essentially send 6 Battering Bolts is huge value, which is why this card is so expensive. Inertia can give you a value based upon what you get on the top of your deck. And it doesn't really generate your opponent value because if they do get something good off the top, they have to discard something. And if they had to block out that turn in general, then that card that they get just gets sent to the bottom of the deck anyways. So this card has a little bit more implied value for you because it can actually get something good for you, or just give them something bad that just clogs up their arsenal for a turn. Plan for the Worst has a lot of contextual value associated with it, where you get full information on what's in their hand and arsenal that lets you choose the best plan for the next turn. It lets you then look at your deck for 3 traps, reveal them, and then you can put 2 cards back in entirety. So if you have an extra card in hand for some reason, you can't convert that into a trap that might be better for the situation. Worst case scenario, you do get whatever trap that helps you deal with that situation the most. To add to that, you also get that little line there that says essentially seek and destroy effect. And if they have things like D-Reacts, you'll be able to actually just catch them with them and destroy them outright because, for the most part, they will usually not be able to pitch them. Quick Dodge is similar to AB, where it converts 1 resource into 2 value every time you utilize it, based upon the number of chain links your opponent creates, and in the case that you arsenaled a non-D-React, or let's say a blue arrow off of a ponder, you can trench it away and generate some block value off of it on Quick Dodge, which I have done on countless times. I appreciate you guys listening to this long, drawn-out section. It is incredibly important to understand we do evaluation of cards, and by doing so, it allows you to really, really push the boundaries of what you can do and how much advantage you can generate off of Riptide.